You know, as I've sat and listened this evening to the tributes of Congressman Hyde, a couple things have become clear to me. That there's an element, a great sense of loss tonight among us about a man that people on both sides of the aisle really came to respect and admire and deeply appreciate. As I've thought about Congressman Hyde and the role that he played, came to Congress in 1974, and that was a very difficult time for the Republican Party. He's one of the few people that was successful in a campaign after the scandal of Watergate, and came in, and in a way, Henry Hyde was a conservative in the House of Representatives before conservative was cool. He was passionate about a strong America and understanding fundamentally what our nation's role was in the world. We talked a lot over the past several minutes about Henry Hyde and his pro-life legacy. There was another passion that he had, and I think it was inextricably linked to his view of life and defending it at all ages, and that was his high view of freedom. He was a person who understood fundamentally that the United States had a very special role to play. I was a staffer for him and remember him talking about the captive nations. That was a phrase that was used to capture the description of the Eastern Bloc nations. And you see in Henry Hyde's district, in the 6th District of Illinois, there were a whole host of immigrants, folks who had come to this land of America because America was free. And Henry Hyde represented that constituency well, and it was a people that had been formed largely by their suffering under a tyrannical communist regime. And when Henry Hyde came to office in 1974, and in those years before the 1980 election, he was among a small group of people in the House, I think, that really understood what was at stake. Turned out Ronald Reagan won a historic election in 1980. It was a landslide, really of epic proportions. And Henry Hyde was one of those people that was positioned in the House of Representatives, Mr. Speaker, to be one of Ronald Reagan's partners over the next 8 years on what has been nothing short of a transformation of American foreign policy. Henry Hyde was a pivotal figure in the mid-'80s when the House turned to him and asked him to play a key role at the time in the Iran-Contra investigation. And I remember working for him at that time and a whole great deal of activity. And when I was looking at my boss, then Congressman Hyde, during the committee hearings, and every time he asked a question, every time he made a point, there was a sense of clarity about him that was just very, very inviting. He understood what was going on. He didn't shy away from a political fight, as we all know, but he had this way about him that was a way to engage people in such a way that he was able to persuade them. He was sort of the old school of American politics, and that he wasn't satisfied merely to have a debate. No. This was a guy that wanted to persuade you, and his view was, look, if you knew what I knew, and if you had seen what I have seen, and if you understand what I understand, then surely, looking at this evidence, you'll be persuaded as I am to this way of thinking. And I think the way that he approached that, Mr. Speaker, was very inviting in a way. Listen, he was at a pivotal point in our public life together in very, very difficult times for our country. But we all know, as we reflect on this great man, that he did it with a sense of duty, he did it with a sense of honor, and he did it in a way that he always upheld his oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States. I remember the first time I met Henry Hyde, I was interviewing in his office, and it was when he was in the Rayburn Building, room 2104 in the Rayburn Building. It was, I think, an April evening, if I'm not mistaken, in the mid-'80s, and I had a chance to interview with my own Congressman, Henry Hyde, to become possibly a legislative assistant. I went in, I handed him my resume, and I have an independent recollection as I'm standing here today, of Henry Hyde looking out over me in these half glasses and kind of clearing his throat, looking at the resume, sort of looking it over. And I remember feeling very intimidated because at the time, after all, I was in a conversation with Henry Hyde. Well, to make a long story short, he very graciously offered me the job. And what I'll say is this: you know, we serve with a whole cast of characters here in Congress. And we see one another many times on the floor, and we interact with one another, and we see one another in the hallways. But when you really want to get to know a member, you ask to the staff, what is that person really like? The staff people that are working for that member, out of the public view, behind closed doors in the office when nobody's around. And I'll tell you this, Henry Hyde was the same person to work for as the person who would appear here on the floor of the House of Representatives. He was gracious. Now, he expected you to work hard. He expected excellence on the part of his staff, and he wanted you to do a good job. But the same pleasant man that you encountered and is fondly remembered here this evening was the same person that interacted with his staff. You know, there's different ways to measure people, and I called Congressman Hyde on the phone in April of this year. I was walking into the Cannon building. It was an early morning, and I called him on my cell phone, and I caught him at home. It was fairly early, and I said, Henry, I have been here for 4 months. I said, I marvel at what you were able to accomplish during the time that you were here. You know, many of us come from legislative bodies, state legislatures or county legislative bodies, and they're fairly intimate affairs, actually. They're fairly small groups of legislators that come together. But when you think of the figurative shadow that he cast on legislation for the past 30 years, it was a thing to behold. I know he enjoyed the phone call, but it wasn't false flattery. It was actually admiration from somebody who has recently come to succeed him in Congress. Finally, in closing, Mr. Speaker, I remember when I sat with Congressman Hyde several months before I came to this body, and at the end of a very pleasant conversation as we went back and forth on issues and talked about local politics and state politics and national politics and all kinds of issues, he said a word to me, when I share it with you, Mr. Speaker, is going to sound like a very common thing. But when you're me and you're seated and you're across from Henry J. Hyde, it didn't sound very common at that point. And he said to me this. He said, Peter, this is important work in Congress. This is important work. And there was an urgency with what he was saying to me that day. And it wasn't the whimsy of an old man who was just reflecting back on 32 years of service, but it was the admonition of a statesman who had looked out over the horizon and really understood the great challenges, but even more, the great opportunities that are here for us in the United States of America. So I know that I am joined by many, many, many Americans who considered Henry Hyde to be their congressman, to be America's congressman. And so it is with a great sense of pride and also a great sense of sadness and loss that I rise today, like so many of my colleagues, to honor his memory.